Welcome you all to another Abraline ao Vivo event. I'm Cilene Rodrigues from PUC Rio, and it's a great pleasure to be with you again. When life gives us lemons, make lemonade. Although this pandemic situation may have impacted our lives, we can seize the moment and taking it as an opportunity to exchange ideas with people from all over the world. We're grateful to Abraline and all the other linguistic associations that made this possible. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting a panel section on argument structure, composed by Professors Artemis Alexiadou, Gillian Ramchand, and Heidi Harley. The goal of this panel is to evaluate the relevance of investigations on argument structure to the study of grammar. Is this a coherent area of research? How internal properties of verbs and nouns interact with syntax, semantics, and morphology? What are the results established so far? And what are the issues at the forefront in the study of argument structure? These are the inquiries that will keep us busy this afternoon. Allow me to say that as a woman, I feel quite honored to be here today. Alexiadou's, Ramchand's, and Harley's work reveal that women are perfectly capable of conducting research. Women are to be part of science not only to guarantee gender equality, but also because of our potential. With or without makeup, and regardless from where we are and where we come from, we can and we do contribute qualitatively to the development of science. Let me introduce our guests. Professor Artemis Alexiadou is currently at Humboldt University at Berlin. She is also the Vice Director of the Lebanese Center General Linguistics, ZAS, Artemis has conducted research on different topics in comparative syntax, morphology, and semantics, considering the clausal and the nominal domain. She has also worked on heritage language. I believe this afternoon she will talk about nominalizations. Artemis, Efharistopoli, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation and good evening from Berlin.
Thank you. Professor Gillian Ramchand is at University of Tromsø. Although Gillian has worked on different topics, she's an expert on semantics and syntax, focusing on argument structure. She has conducted investigations on anti-causatives, alternating adjectives, event structure, and so on. She directed the project Transitive Alternation, experimental investigations in English and Norwegian. Today, she will give us a critical overview of our current understanding of argument structure. Gillian, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation. Professor Heidi Harley is at University of Arizona, and her work centers around syntax as the generative component of human grammar. She has worked on verbal morphosyntax, argument structure, and agreement in different languages. Today, she will talk about causatives and applicatives. In Heidi's webpage, one reads, sentences are not built out of words. Words are built out of sentences. Thus, it's very likely that today she will give us the structural skeleton of causatives and applicative constructions. Heidi, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much. After the talk, we'll have a period for questions. So please send us your questions, comments, and or suggestions. Gillian, it will start with you. So the microphone is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my screen so that we are there. Okay. Thanks to everyone joining us from all over the world. We have a feast for you. We'll talk about argument structure. And it's my job to convince you that argument structure is something that you should care about too. Argument structure is not just for lexicalists. It's not just for specialists in verbal meaning. I think that all linguists should have some considered beliefs and commitments in this domain. So I first want to talk sort of in big picture terms about why I think argument structure, this area, is interesting and important. So if you think about it at a very basic level, the phrase structure of the clause involves the interleaving of nominal and verbal or predicational projections, which builds up to a sentence of propositional meaning. But there's an interesting asymmetry between verbs and nouns, in particular between truth-making in the verbal domain and truth-making in the nominal domain. In the following sense, the truth of a proposition in the standard case requires the existence of nominal reference. but nominal reference does not standardly depend on the truth of any particular proposition. So how does that work? Well, it's the verbs. The interesting thing is that verbs select or require nominal satellites as part and parcel of the described eventuality that they represent. And so argument structure is nothing less than the study of the relationships that trigger the composition of nominal projections with verbal projections. And therefore, in my view, it is we should think of that as a key part of the engine of meaning building in natural language. And for that reason, I think we should all be interested in. Okay, so it's the verbs that are selecting the arguments. Let's look at a few examples of verbs in English. I've chosen them from English because I've made up all of these. Let's imagine these representations in the lexicon. The verb like, for example, it expresses the fact of a positive emotional relationship existing between a liker and a thing or person liked. Or the verb give. The verb give describes a situation in which an outwardly directed action on the part of X, a giver, transfers possession temporarily or permanently of the given thing, Y, to the givee, Z. Or yet again, the verb build. This conjures up the situation in which the wielder of some initiating force, the builder, brings into gradual existence the artifactual object Y, the buildee. Okay, so is there anything of linguistic interest here at all? Why don't we just assume that a verbal lexical item is just listed with this idiosyncratic information in the form of likers and likees, builders and buildees, with nothing of generality except those patterns that maybe come from our general cognitive tendencies, the way we conceive of or conceptualize, distinguish events. Actually, this is not an implausible view to take. I read Doughty 1991, that's a famous paper, his proto-roles paper. I read that paper as essentially espousing that idea. So the idea would go as follows. There's a sort of different and specific set of roles specific to each individual verbal lexical item in language, and that's what you have to memorize. But there are some cognitive tendencies underpinning those choices as lexicalized by verbs. And these cognitive tendencies will feed lexicalization, but they're not part of any sort of online SynSam system or online computation. And this view makes argument structure a kind of memorized black box, the internal workings of which the rest of syntax can safely ignore. But the reality is a little bit more interesting than this. So instead of rigid memorized stuff, I think what we know now is that argument structure is more like rule-governed flexibility. So sure, the conceptual content of verbal meaning needs to be memorized and stored in your lexicon, but the co-occurrence with nominal satellites, as we've discovered by looking at the very many different frames that nearly every verb can occur in, that's much less fixed and more variable than the implementational device of a memorized subcat frame. Remember those from your first syntax class? It doesn't work. Memorized frames are neither descriptively nor explanatory adequate, because what we have discovered too is that argument structure patterns and generalizations exist, and it seems therefore that they share some of the procedural or rule-governed character of syntax. Okay, so there are generalizations. So what are they? They're theta roles, right? We got taught that in Graduate Syntax 101. Well, yeah, that was the beginning, but no, not theta roles. And if you don't believe me on that, believe the giants of lexical argument structure, Beth Levine and Malka Hovav, who wrote a summary monograph, a kind of state-of-the-art historical summary in 2005. And they conclude pretty much the same thing, that traditional thematic hierarchies, role lists, don't actually work consistently, but there is some element of hierarchy there that you can see. But the apparent thematic hierarchy effects arise, in fact, because of, and here I'm quoting them, embedding relations among arguments in an event structure are always respected in argument realization, with more embedded arguments receiving less prominent syntactic realizations. So we're going to go into this idea in a little bit more detail. I will show you concretely what it is I think we know, but also what I think is important to emphasize here is this is this view. Levine and Rappaport-Hovave go through many different kinds of frameworks for talking about these sorts of substantive generalizations, from Croft to Levine and Rappaport to Barrère, Jackendoff. There's a consensus here, and this is what I'm going to try to convey in this presentation. Okay, so basically, most specialists, regardless of their architecture, preferred architecture or ideology, they favor an extremely reduced, more event-oriented set of rules. And what I want to do in the next few slides is give you, in sort of potted form, there's no time, of course, to go through all the details in argumentation. You can find those things in Levine and Rappaport's monograph and in all the other literature that I cite there. But I'm going to give you a potted version of what we think the take-home message is, the main generalization. And first I'll talk about external arguments, and then I'll move and talk about internal arguments, which are a little bit more complicated. So with respect to external arguments, it appears that if you look for hierarchies underpinning syntactic phenomena like agreement or subject selection, or height in binding or whatever, what you find over and over again is that there's a pattern there. So if there is more than one event participant, if, for example, you have an agent and a theme or a patient, it's always the case, and this seems to be an exceptionalist generalization, it's always the case that you'll choose the agent as the subject and the patient as the object, and not the other way around. Provided they both have to be expressed as DPs, it always goes that way around and never the reverse. And people have tried to find exceptions to this, sort of true syntactic ergativity or whatever, and there's no convincing cases. But agent is a very crude cover term for a much more heterogeneous set of participant roles. They can't all be characterized by agent because it doesn't actually matter whether it's animate or intentional or whatever. You see in one a wide variety of number of things that count as external arguments, or the privileged argument in this calculation. And in the next slide, I show you the box, in which I try to characterize in abstract terms what that generalization is. And it goes like this. In a dynamic eventuality, a causing participant, so in other words, one whose existence directly or indirectly, deliberately or inadvertently is asserted to bring about the change in question, that argument is hierarchically privileged in feeding syntactic operations. And this includes both inanimate and abstract causes, facilitators like instruments, and even inanimate objects that are prime movers. You get the picture. Sort of very abstract causers. Okay, so that's the external one, and now moving swiftly along to the internal one, internal argument. Are there generalizations there, or is it just the thing that's not the external argument? That's not true. There are actually some substantive important semantic generalizations about what makes a good internal argument. And a good way to show you that is to go back to a very, very old case of the spray-load alternation, because what I like about this example is that it gives you a pair of sentences where they could both, in principle, be used to describe the same event going on in the world. But once you look closely at the sentences themselves, you see that they have different semantic entailments depending on what you've chosen as the subject. So in 2A, the hay needs to be used up for the event to be complete, whereas in 2B, the truck needs to be completely loaded for the event to be complete. So this means in some sense, the internal argument is measuring out the event. That's the original sort of statement from Tenney. But as we'll see, it's a little bit more complicated to state precisely what's at stake here. So there was a lot of early work by Foucault, and he noticed that if John ate porridge, that was atelic, but if he ate the sandwich, then it was telic. And what people saw was that the temporal boundedness of the event was determined by the material boundedness of the object in these cases. So there's some kind of homomorphism, so that the boundedness of the object carries over to the boundedness of the event with these kinds of verbs. So that was a really interesting subclass of cases, and it led to a lot of syntacticians importing features like plus telic or plus quantity in their sort of featural decomposition of the internal argument. But again, it is a bit more subtle than that, because this case of creation consumption verbs is just one subcase of a more general notion, which has been a lot of semantic work done in the noughties on paths of change and scalar change. And it turns out that this is the abstract overarching idea that we need to get a grip on if we want to understand what makes a good internal argument. So a path of change does not have to be like consuming an object. It's perfectly general. So paths of change can involve motion along a physical path, and it can also involve property changing in a gradable fashion. So creation consumption verbs is just a special case of what happens in dynamic predicates, where there is some sort of path of change, and there is something going on in the event which is mapped onto the temporal timeline in this homomorphic way. Okay, so what does an object do then with respect to a path of change? Well, there's a number of different things. The examples in 4 that you see, they're up there because I want to emphasize the point that just because you're a quantized object does not mean that the sentence that you occur in is going to be telic. That only occurs for creation consumption verbs. What you have to look at is the particular path of change. So if John melted the chocolate for hours, the chocolate is undergoing some change. So there is a path of change there, but it's undergoing a change. And you can push the cart for hours, and the cart is traveling a spatial path. So you can always see this spatial path, and the object is somehow always intimately tied up in the description of the path of change. So here in sentence 5, you see A through B, a lot of examples of arguments that make good objects. So in 5a, you see an object that's undergoing spatial motion. And the chocolate is undergoing a property change. It's going from solid to liquid. In C, the object is undergoing a change and achieving a final state. Here's an interesting one in 5e. The DP object there is actually describing the whole path. And I would argue that in 5f, the DP is also describing the path. And then in G, you even have a DP which is expressing a measure of the path, a sort of temporal measure of the path of change. So what do all of these things have in common? Well, the generalization, the internal argument generalization is that when you have a dynamic eventuality, those that express some sort of change, a participant that is defined in relation to the path, it's defined in relation to the path of change, that holds a privileged role. That is the internal argument in the semantic sense. So that's going to include undergoers, result holders, measures, path descriptors, etc. All the DPs that are involved there. Okay, so now I have given you what I think is the state-of-the-art understanding of what are the semantic correlates of the sort of internal and external argument distinction, the ones that feed syntactic behavior. And now what I want to do is talk a little bit about event structure decomposition, because that's going to be part of my argument that there is something really systematic going on here. Well, the event structure decomposition literature tends to come more from semantics, but I think there are many people in the interface working on this as well. Again, I'm just going to be very brief and concise and summarize what we know. The very first thing you need to know about event decomposition is you have to make a basic distinction between states and events. So states, static eventualities, and dynamic events when some kind of stuff is going on. Okay, so states and events in English, you can convince yourself very easily that this is something that really matters for the grammar. So there's loads of things in English, it's loads of syntactic effects that hinge on whether something is a state or an event. The interpretation of the present tense, whether you get universal readings under the perfect, whether you get particular kinds of epistemic readings under must, etc., etc. So state versus event is a very important division within event types. But even when we get to dynamic events, there are subtypes. And these are well known from the Aristotelian classification. I've decomposed them a little bit, slightly different vocabulary here, but it should still be familiar to you. There's the activities, which are just processes, which are going on and on and on. But sometimes a process can end up in a state, a result state. That's a culminated process or an accomplishment. And then you also have culminations where the process leading up to it is curtailed. It's not really dragged out. And you have the pure states. So you can see the different types of event types as deconstructions of a big event in terms of sub-events. And if you do that, and I'm going to notate a sub-event that's dynamic as E sub D and a sub-event that's static as E sub S. If you do that, then what you see is the picture I give you on that next slide, which is that the actual complex event types that are expressed by verbs in natural language are the event complexity. There is event decomposition, there are sub-events, but that decomposition is, the complexity of that decomposition is constrained. So you can only basically get one dynamic sub-event, one independent dynamic sub-event, but you can augment that with upstream states and downstream states. So you can have a state leading to a dynamic thing, you can have a dynamic thing leading to a state, and you can have the full decomposition as you see on the bottom there. So this is what we think of, this is the basic typology of Aktionsart types, if you will, that you find in natural language. And now on the next slide, I will show you what I call the event complexity generalization, which is a generalization about how this semantic complexity manifests in a syntactic representation. Because after all, you know, semanticists are always going off and finding all sorts of cool, interesting distinctions, but it's really striking when the typology or the set of distinctions also have a very reliable syntactic reflex in terms of hierarchy. And this is what we find here. So what we find is that if you see an event that has decompositional complexity, when you add a causing event to something, that is always hierarchically higher in the syntactic structure. And if you add a result sub-event, that's always added hierarchically more embedded, lower in the hierarchical structure. This is just always the case. So the event decomposition, semantic event decompositions that we find also map onto syntactic hierarchy in this extremely reliable way. Okay, so here is the thing, the interesting and really striking fact to me. And that is that when you look at the argument structure generalizations, you look at the event Aktionsart generalizations, they are exactly in lockstep. They go together, they mirror each other completely. So there isn't two generalizations here. There's just one generalization. The cause event is higher, and the argument that is associated with the cause event, the causer, is also higher. The result event is always more deeply embedded, and it's lower. Associated with holding the result state is also lower. And the argument that undergoes the change, the one that's associated with the process event, the dynamic event, well, that one can either be the subject, the highest one, or a lower one, depending on what else is there. So that's more in the middle. And moreover, in both argument structure and event structure, of course, there's only one delimitation possible, only one distinct dynamic sub-event. So it seems to me that these generalizations, this mapping to hierarchy, is very systematic, and it's really one generalization. And if we take that seriously, that's going to really change the way we think about participant roles, thematic roles, okay? Because I'm going to argue that you can really get extremely minimalistic with respect to roles or participant roles if you take this kind of hierarchy seriously. Right, so the hierarchical representation of argument positions correlates with the hierarchical position of the sub-event they are related to. Right? So to summarize what we've seen so far, there is a pattern, there's a system. Causal embedding matters hierarchy in the syntax. The arguments related to those sub-events also come out hierarchically in the syntax. And it's important to note that simple semantics or function argument composition does not give you this, because the lambda calculus is very powerful. It can describe anything the syntax gives it. You're not getting the explanation for that from semantic notation. And similarly, syntacticians, you can't just bandy about functional heads and put them in any order you like. There is a semantic generalization there. So we have to have a place in the theory to express these substantive constraints, okay? And I think they are there. There's a lot of consensus about them. It's a matter of empirical record, and we have figured out a lot of these patterns now. But we are still, I think, in the process of really creating theories that build these in. How can we encode these substantive constraints? Well, one way in which I've tried to do it is to constrain the way in which hierarchical representation is built up and the way it maps to semantic relations. Like, for example, to say that sub-events, when they combine, always are linked via a causing or leads to relation, and also the nature of the primitive semantic relations that go along with these primitive syntactic configurations. And we need to state this explicitly because function argument composition covers a wide range of intuitively different semantic relations, but these, I think, are much more constrained. So just to give you one example of the way I try to formulate what I think is going on, is that the semantic glue that seems to be operating here that matches hierarchy and syntax is that sub-evental embedding is interpreted by the system as causation, and that the merge of a DP specifier at whatever height corresponds to predication, not just, the first argument into a function. I mean, very basic, intuitive Aristotelian property predication, a simple entity holding a property. So when you merge a DP specifier, the entailment you get is that DP holds the property expressed by that constituent. And then, of course, we also need some sort of conjunction, event identification to put together the denotations of these different sub-events. So event structure hierarchies and participant relation hierarchies track each other quite directly. And what this tells us is we can get the hierarchy. We don't have to stipulate the hierarchy in terms of thematic roles. We just need the simple hierarchical representation of events. And we need generalized property predication, and that will give us the patterns that we see. So if we return to this general architectural question of memorization versus generative devices, what do we know? I think what we know now, I think everyone probably agrees, is that thematic roles are not listed and memorized as part of verbal lexical entries. But we do need detailed event descriptions. Those are memorized. Those are part of what we know, and we know the meaning of a verb. And then the connections to the nominal projections come from something quite, remember, that was the sort of engine of meaning building. That was sort of the general property that created propositions. And these connections turn out to be very, very abstract or very, very powerful, but also very cognitively general. The connections to the nominal projections come from general principles of property predication. And those are the things that link participants to situational descriptions. And what about semantic selection? Well, there's semantic selection too, but that's basically in the form of real world knowledge, which tells you what kinds of participants can reasonably hold which kinds of properties. So, my final slide, argument structure for the 21st century. What do we do? Where do we go? What do we have? What can we use? What's the advice for the man on the street linguists out there who might not be a specialist in argument structure? I think in the 21st century, we really have to say, right, no more traditional theta role labels, no to that. No to thematic role assignment, that's really so 20th century. Or the theta criterion. And also, please no free pass just to invent any functional head you like and stick in an argument wherever it goes, because we know there are patterns in general. So we need to be sensitive to the semantic patterns that UG seems to allow. Yes to structured representations. There are structured representations, including arguments, which have reliable entailments concerning participancy in sub-events. Yes to more theorizing about how verbal memorized forms systematically determine or match those structural representations. And yes, also to the explicit study of how various morphosyntactic devices systematically change or modulate how event structures are then used, carried forward into more complex syntactic structures and different constructions. And I think that's what Heidi and Artemis will be telling you about in more detail. And that is the end. Thank you. Those are my references. And stop share. And I'm going to.
Oh, I don't know if there's a transition between us, but I'll just be it. I'll be the transition. So thanks, Gillian, and we're gonna exactly build upon the concepts and structures that.
Thank you, Gillian. We'll now go to Heidi's presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Cilene. I will share my screen. So I have a classic handout for your viewing pleasure. Getting it, there we go, good. But I see that if I drop it in the, I will drop it in the chat window, but I don't think that people can get it that way. But I'll make it available in case you would like to refer to it later via Dropbox. I'll share that link later on, but there's the whole link. Anyway, just be patient, I'll be the scroller. All right, so Gillian has taken us from a view of argument structure that we had in the sort of mid to late 20th century to the kind of early 21st century view. So we started out with this idea that we had verbs that had theta roles that needed assigning. The theta roles might be organized in some kind of a hierarchy. The syntactic resources that we had at our disposal were pretty much verb phrase, inflectional phrase, and complementizer phrase. And that we might have, sub portion of the field converged on the idea that grammatical roles, subject, object, indirect object, were not primitives of the theory, but were defined by their location or by the structural position configurationally. We had a theory of argument structure operations that manipulated these things. Now, these things were individual properties of individual verbs, so they were in the lexicon. So we had a generative lexicon where you could look at a verb, detect what its theta roles were, operate on those theta roles, and spit out a new verb. So we were committed to a generative lexical component as well as a generative syntactic component. And then crucially, we had a theory that took theta roles or classes of theta roles and mapped them to the syntactic structure. So whether that was something in the vein of a Dowdy proto-role view of things or a Baker-Utah view of things, there was a theory about the relationship between these lexical representations and the syntactic structure that was like an independent component of the theory. Transitioning from this kind of view of what argument structure was to this kind of a view took what Gillian just described for us, the sort of recognition that what we thought were theta roles were really event roles. So with the kind of detailed semantic investigation of events that went on from like 1980 through now, we were able to kind of recognize that this style of representation was not fine-grained enough, or too fine-grained in some cases. So it didn't make crucial distinctions like the ones that Gillian was pointing to about aspectual properties. And it made too many distinctions when it came to knowing the difference between, say, builders and lovers or whatever. Actually, that's not a great example, but anyway, with that kind of innovation pioneered by Levine and Rappaport and Jack and Doff and others, Tenney, we arrived at a view of theta roles where we needed this complex event structure representation in the lexicon. So the sort of leap to a syntacticized view of it hadn't quite been made yet. But with the kind of idea that we have hierarchical structure that represents the composing of different kinds of sub-events, it's a small jump to say, oh, well, maybe those sub-events are projected in the syntax. And that's how they get composed together along the lines that Gillian has outlined. The particular labels of the consensus way that sub-events get put together are immaterial. Gillian has these sort of semantically inspired labels. A lot of folks have these kind of morphosyntactically inspired labels. But the, the sort of key content that's associated with the different labels is largely similar. So that's how we got there in terms of semantic discoveries. We also made a bunch of syntactic discoveries in the course of arriving at this kind of picture of the composed syntactic argument structure, that all of which pointed to this direction that we needed a more complex view of the verb phrase. I mean, verbs are complicated little beasts, so it makes sense that a more complex view of the verb phrase is going to give us some explanation. Here are some of the syntactic developments that pushed us to this kind of a picture as well. Larson showed us that if we wanted to simultaneously capture the argument structure of ditransitive verbs and the hierarchical relationships between the arguments of ditransitive verbs, we needed more than just a verb phrase and an X-bar template. there was no room in the XBAR template with a single verb phrase to allow us to have 3 arguments. We had specifier, complement, and then the third argument had to come in some structurally impossible way that would put it in the wrong hierarchical location. So he proposed that we had this VP shell structure. Noam Chomsky was interested in doing away with the XBAR template and deriving structure entirely from operation and operation merge, which the sort of conceptual basis for that structure building hypothesis meant that it was impossible to distinguish between unergative intransitive verbs and unaccusative intransitive verbs because you don't have any vacuous projection. So if you're going to merge an argument with a verb, it's going to look the same whether that argument is agentive or is a theme. However, if you have a theory of agentive arguments where they get introduced in a higher projection, sort of in the Halen-Kaiser style approach to unergative verbs, then you can have a structural distinction between unergatives and unaccusatives, even with this super stripped down view of what phrase structure is. And of course, we need a structural difference between unergatives and unaccusatives to capture a whole, to maintain our view of the whole cross-linguistic discovery that was the unaccusativity hypothesis. Causative and codative alternations have kind of suggested this kind of view of things since early days. If you need to introduce an external argument, be nice to have, and at the same time as you introduce a causative meaning, might be nice to have a causative functor that you can add to an encodative verb to yield that. That's the sort of easiest, earliest idea that came to us from the generative semantics literature. And this kind of conceptualization of the verb phrase that Gillian laid out for us, where we can have different functors introducing different arguments, is exactly going to give us that. Kratzer made an extremely influential argument about the etiology of agents and the structure on the basis of a generalization about idioms necessarily being agentless. And then a very influential paper by von Steckow, and also a bunch of evidence about modification of the result state, sort of sub-eventual modification from the generative semantics literature, conspired to suggest that it would be awfully nice to have a projection that you could point to the result sub-event and say, let's modify that. Or let's modify the initiating sub-event separately. So, and then we wouldn't need any very special semantic operations to do that kind of modification. We just use our normal syntax of modification and predicate modification operations. So we had a whole bunch of syntactic results that were leading us in this direction. We had the event structural discoveries about thematic structure that Gillian outlined for us, and they fit together like pizza and Coke. They just peanut butter and chocolate was the clearly the right thing. So in the end, we have some structural hypotheses about the composition of events, so that leave us with testable structural directions to go with our empirical investigation. So for example, the little VP is where we expect to see dynamic event arguments introduced into the structure. So if we can find syntactic evidence for the presence of little VP, we expect to find semantic evidence that there's a dynamic event around. If Gillian is right that the sort of lowest part of the structure is a result state, then we expect to see a result state or some kind of state of eventuality attached to structures that have that lowest part of the structure present. And of course, we expect to see agentivity, and other kinds of semantic things connected to initiation and external arguments if we have a voice phrase present in the structure. This also gives us a hook, now that we have a syntactic structure to represent this, this gives us a hook to the morphological interface, since we expect heads to have the potential to contribute a morph to a verb form. So we do not want to see, universally, I mean, we might want to see universally vacuous syntactic structure in some cases, but in the sort of default assumption is that if we have a syntactic head, we might expect to see that syntactic head overtly realized in some context in some language. So we might expect to see heads that denote, dynamic eventualities or verbalization. Might expect to see voice morphology. This structure gives us a place to put all of that beautiful morphology that people had been a black box before the advent of these kinds of things. Syntactically had been a black box. We also might expect morphological things to correlate with locality to the root. So we could look at the well-established morphological observation that the closer you are to a root, the more likely you are to get interacting with that root in terms of irregularity or productivity or something like that. We might then expect to see syntactic correlates or possibly semantic correlates of this kind of morphological generalization if we're going to take all these morphological pieces and put them in the syntax. We already had a well-established tradition of looking at different kinds of complementation and ascribing different properties to different classes of complements based on what we know about the content of their projection. So in the study of clausal complementation, is a very productive hypothesis that some clausal complements are TPs and some clausal complements are CPs, and that you see different kinds of properties associated with the different complements depending on the size of the complement. Susie Wurmbrand took that idea and ran with it in studying restructuring infinitives and made great use of the sort of verbal decomposition into little VP versus big VP to sort of dissect the behavior, the syntactic behavior of various kinds of restructuring infinitives. The sort of three-way breakdown into voice P, little VP, and root P suggests that we should also be looking for cases where we see the three different kinds of complementation available with bringing their different kinds of properties to the resulting structure. So I'm going to show you a few different cases of that kind of analysis where we see kind of a tripartite breakdown between root P complementation, little VP complementation, and voice P complementation. By now, there's actually a lot of literature that draws on this analytical possibility. I'm just going to show you a few possibilities, some of which are sort of filtered through my own idiosyncratic views of things. The first one I'm going to show you was brought to us by Elena Agnostopoulou and my colleague here, Artemis, in a series of work on the structure of Greek participles. So participles derive kind of adjectival structures. They initially identified three different classes of such participles in Greek, one formed with the stos suffix, one and two others formed with menos. And in investigating their syntactic and semantic properties, they seem to line up very well with the idea that those participles contain just the stative piece of the structure, where we have asp here as the sort of head that introduces the participializing morphology. The first class of menos participles incorporated properties that we would expect if the asp head took a little VP as its complement. And the other kind of menos participles had the kind of properties that we would expect if the ASP phrase was participalizing a voice phrase, a very large piece of verbal argument structure. So what are some of the kinds of things we expect? Well, given what we learned from Gillian about the semantics of these different pieces of argument structure, we expect TOS participles to not introduce any dynamic event, any sense of being derived from a prior dynamic event, whereas we expect something that has a little VP in it to include entailments about the prior event, and obviously something that has voice in it, similar. Dave Embeck introduced this nice test for distinguishing these different kinds of things by asking whether or not you can have them as depictives in the complement of creation verbs. So creation verbs have the special lexical property that they talk about the moment at which their theme argument came into existence. So something like the door was built, and then you have our little depictive open here. That makes sense. You could build a door with a certain kind of a property. But since the door is coming into existence at the end of the building event, it cannot have gone through any prior event. So we expect that any kind of adjectival participle that indicates, that presupposes a prior event of the thing that it's predicated of, are going to be bad as modifiers of the theme complement of creation verbs. So we see this kind of effect just in the English here. The door was built open makes sense. The door was built opened is a little odd because it presupposes an event that the door went through, but the door didn't exist. And this lines up perfectly with the sort of characteristic state participle, those participles. They are perfectly good in the complement of the Greek translation of build, but neither of the menos participles are acceptable in this sort of depictive position. If manner predicates are modifiers that tell you something about the process of a verbal event, of a dynamic verbal event, then we expect a sort of a low structure to rule out the possibility of manner modification, and a bigger piece of structure that includes a dynamic event to allow the possibility of manner modification. And guess what? That is true. Those characteristic state particles don't allow manner modification. The menos participles do allow it. And finally, there's a bunch of agent-oriented modifications that you could imagine, things that talk to you about the modifiers, like, carefully, that talk to you about the intentions and behavior of the agent. You certainly do not expect those kinds of modifiers to exist in the characteristic state participles. You do expect them to exist in the participles that include a piece that introduces the agent. That's this menos class of menos participles. And this class of menos participles that includes only the little VP, you expect the agent-oriented modifiers to be unacceptable because there's no agent of entailments introduced into the structure. And similarly, if biphrases require a voice head to attach to, then you expect no biphrases for these two, and you expect biphrases for this one. And that's exactly the pattern that you get. Like everything, life turned out to be somewhat more complicated because there's a whole nother class of TOS participles that both Artemis and Elena and Samiotti have worked on since then. But it seems like you can get a TOS participle that gives you a modalized ability meaning, this kind of learnable or eatable, edible kind of meaning, these ability passives. You can get that kind outside voice, and it still uses that TOS piece. There's a good side and a bad side to this. So one is it kind of muddies up the waters of a simple selectional constraint on TOS that it wants the root P, and a simple selectional view of menos that it wants the little VP. But the good side is that we actually expect the same kind of state of aspectual adjectivization to be realized by similar similar morphemes wherever they attach. So that is one of the key features of this family of analyses introduced by Embeck and also Miyagawa, showing you that you get the same piece of morphology no matter where you attach it in the system. Okay, so that's what you see in the Greek participle system that makes the whole structure very pleasing, the whole sort of morphosyntax semantics relationship, very pleasing. The next thing I want to talk about is this sort of proposal of applicative topology that came from Pilkinen, Pilkinen's original work, and then was further developed in a whole pile of other work. But I'm going to particularly focus on Cristina Cuervo's discussion of it, and then some work that I did on Hyaki. What do applicatives do? Applicatives are a piece of valence changing morphology where you stick it on a verb and they come in, if you have an overt applicative anyway, and they introduce an unselected object or goal argument to the event structure of the verb. And in general, so the applied argument always appears in a position C-commanded by the external argument. So again, it seems to suggest that the external argument is out there on the top, as Gillian talked about. And then typically the applied argument will C-command any selected objects that you have, although there's typological patterns cross-linguistically about whether the applied argument and the selected object are in a hierarchical relationship or not. But let's say that in the default case they are. The sort of importance of applicatives for the motivation for the overall framework is that the decomposed little VP concept makes a syntactic analysis of applicatives possible via the addition of an argument introducing applicative head that takes something smaller than voice P as its complement. So if you want to have a new argument introduced syntactically that intervenes between the agent and the theme, that argument had better come in, can only come in if the agent is introduced by a separate projection. If you are in a world where the agent is the argument of the verb directly, it's just sitting in specifier of VP, like it was, say, in 1990, you cannot monotonically add an applicative argument via and an applicative morpheme in such a way that this thing is C-commanded by the agent, because we have this, reasonable assumption that the first merge position, the sort of thematic or argumental requirements of whatever predicate you have got to be saturated, have got to be satisfied before you go around adding, introducing modifiers or additional material. If we want to hang on to this concept that we want to saturate the argument structure of our predicates before we introduce adjoined material, then we need the subject, the external argument, to be introduced by a separate predicate. That's the only solution. And so the split VP, the exploded VP hypothesis, gave us that option. So we could do applicatives in the syntax instead of doing applicatives via valence changing operations in the generative lexicon. Applicatives are the best argument for a generative lexicon that I know of, but now we don't have to have it. So then we also now have a handle on some of the typological variation in applicatives cross-linguistically. I have called this language academic American English, but sometimes you might call it standard American English or standard English or just English, but let's try to be, alert to the implications of our elsewhere cases. Any case, in this dialect, which I speak, you can add an applied argument, you can add an unselected internal argument to some verbs. In particular, to creation verbs, you can do this. But the fact that you can only do it with creation verbs probably the first codified in Levine's argument structure alternations volume for English, stands in stark contrast to other classes of verbs. I cannot add an unselected internal argument to a change of state transitive verb. I can't say Pat broke Tracy the radio. I can't say Pat held Tracy the suitcase. I can't do it to an unergative intransitive or any kind of intransitive verb. I can't say Pat danced Tracy. That extremely constrained form of applicativization stands in contrast to the applicative possibilities of a language like Spanish, where dative arguments can come in for creation verbs as in English, but also in a superset of those other verbs. Change of state transitives, perfectly fine. Pablo broke Valeria the radio is okay. In these peculiar state of transitive verbs that Pilkinen introduced to us, Pablo held Andreina the bag. It's fine, but Spanish is still more restricted than many other languages in not allowing unergative verbs to applicativize. So you cannot, Pablo can't dance the guests in Spanish. So we are starting to see this kind of subset, superset relationship typology evolve. Then we have languages like Yaqui or Luganda, which is a language that Pilkinen worked on, where you can applicativize anything you want. So in Yaqui, you're restricted to agentive dynamic verbs, but in other languages, applicatives are very broadly available. So Maria can make Jose bread. Simon can kill Maria a deer. That's just like Spanish. And then also the Pascolas can dance the children in Yaqui. I'm going to take Christina's analysis, Cuervo's analysis of the Spanish case a little bit in vain here, because I am so attracted to this kind of tripartite pattern that we see. The Pilkinen's idea about applicatives is that they introduce a argument and relate it to a particular. And in the clause structure that we have a couple different kinds of particulars that the argument can be related to. We have the theme DP, and so the applicative can relate a new argument to that theme DP. That gives you these kind of creation DP applicatives baked on the cake. The DP, I would like to suggest, can also relate, the applicative head can also relate its applied DP to the result particular, the situation that is the result state of a verb. So that gives you these kind of Spanish style transitive applicatives where the main ingredient that you need is a situation argument, saturated situation down at the bottom of the tree. And then you have languages like Yaqui where you can relate, the applicative can relate the applied argument to the dynamic event. So that's an applicative that takes a little VP as its complement. And then you get these very broad applications of applicatives where the applied argument can attach to unergative activities as well as all those other classes of verb. A couple of things to note here about the sort of standard. So that's a sort of a view of this tripartite typology of applicatives. It's not exactly Cuervo's view, but I found it very attractive because of this tripartite structure that we've got motivated. A couple of things to note about the semantics of the applicative. The relationship introduced by applicative is actually not one of Gillian's pieces of semantic glue. It's not a leads to relation. It's something to do with meronomy or containment or possession or control. So when we look at kind of the cognitive glue that we can use within this argument structure domain, we have to kind of keep in mind that this class of relationship is also available. And I think it is interesting to contemplate in connection to the state of eventive distinction that Gillian was emphasizing earlier. This kind of analysis predicts the position of the applied argument in the hierarchy. You've got the agent, then the applied argument, and the theme. You don't need a theory of mapping thematic roles to syntactic positions. The syntactic positions just are the theory. So it's kind of the parallel for thematic roles that Chomsky proposed for grammatical roles way back when, configurational theory of the thematic roles. And then given that the applied argument is always introduced below the voice P with this kind of meronomy relation, it will always participate in a single event within that voice P. So applicatives will not introduce a second event. And that stands in stark contrast to causatives. And I'm starting to get to the end of my time, so I will just focus on one of my little tests that I have here, but I will point out that lots of languages build their causatives via morphological augment on the verb, and that morphological augment, like an applicative, comes with a argumental augment, the causative argument. Unlike the applicative, the causative argument, as Gillian mentioned, always appears in the matrix subject position. It becomes the highest argument in the clause. And the poor former external argument, if it's present, is relegated to some kind of internal grammatical role, as opposed to its previously exalted position as the external argument. So in fact, causatives, morphological causatives, don't pose any special problem for the simple VP view of the verb phrase, but they do pose, their typology poses a problem for that view. So Japanese is going to be our poster child for the kind of classic view of morphological causatives as simply affixal counterparts to, English style causatives where you have a separate causative verb. We'll look at this in terms of the binding domains, I think maybe will be the test that we focus on. So if I have just a single argument structure and a single verb here, so Toru introduced him to Kitahara, we have a pronoun in the internal argument position, and that pronoun, being a good pronoun, cannot co-refer with any of its co-arguments, not the agent and not the goal, because of binding condition B, or the sort of anti-locality requirement on pronoun binding. So he here cannot co-refer in particular with the agent of introducing. But if we have a causative, just as in English, if I say Toru made Kitahara introduce him, Kitahara is the agent of introduction, and we expect him not to be able to co-refer with Kitahara because same binding domain, and him has to be free within its binding domain. But Toru, who's introduced in an external subject position, can bind him in English, and more importantly, it can bind him in Japanese. So Toru made Kitahara introduce him can have exactly this reading that the English has. That tells us that this binding domain down here, that this piece of the structure is a binding domain, right? And that the causative is attached outside that piece of the structure. And if you have a sort of a lexical view of how causatives are built, where you add the causative augment in the lexicon and increase the valence of the whole predicate, and then project that whole predicate monoclausally into the syntax, which was the classic analysis beforehand, you predict that the binding there should just be one binding domain for that causative verb, but there's not. There's two binding domains. So this is a classic, great example to argue that we need a syntactic analysis of morphological causatives in Japanese. Would be great if languages behaved that way cross-linguistically, but maddeningly, they don't. There is another typological class of morphological causative. This is a perfectly productive morphological causative in Turkish. And guess what? If I have something like Tarkan made Hakan beat him in Turkish, where we have the verb beat and the causative augment introducing Tarkon, turns out that the embedded theme cannot be bound by the causer. So it does act exactly like we predict in the lexicalist view, where the causative augment just brings in a new agent, and then the whole thing is projected monoclausally into the syntax. How can we cope with this in the syntactic view of the world? We can say that binding domain is voice P. That's what we can say. So if we say that the voice P encapsulates the binding domain, then condition B says pronouns within voice P have to be free. Then if we introduce a causer with its own voice P in Japanese, the specifier of that voice P can bind something inside the second voice P because the second voice P is the binding domain. However, if Turkish causatives, the Turkish protective causatives don't embed a voice P, if they embed a little VP, then we predict we've got a single binding domain and a pronoun in this embedded event cannot be bound by the specifier of the matrix voice P. And I won't go into it, but we have also got a nice little handle on what a lexical causative might be. It's probably a causative head taking root P as a complement. So this general picture gives us a lot of new horizons and a lot of sort of levers to poke at argument structure with that have very concrete and very testable predictions attached to them. So it has led to this incredibly productive research agenda that I think was not possible before. So it lets us have a minimalist, monotonic, merge-based view of productive valence changing morphology. So we don't need a generative lexicon anymore. We don't need a mapping theory anymore. We are living in a very minimalist view. It can let us ask questions about argument introduction that I think people couldn't ask before. So when Davidson came along, somebody immediately suggested, well, if you're going to just have thematic roles, if you're going to have this kind of predicate-based introduction of arguments, why don't you just do it all over the place? We'll just have theta roles introduce their own predicates. That kind of view, at least, is now syntactically investigatable. And so this kind of possibly unholy marriage of a very stripped down view of argument introduction and a neo-Davidsonian view of argument interpretation you can ask those questions. We couldn't even ask those questions before. And we get a theory where we have clear structural, semantic, and morphological predictions that we can investigate in tandem. We don't have to do our argument structure and our morphology off in one horrible little corner and our event structure and our semantics off in another little corner. We can bring all kinds of evidence to bear on the questions that we are asking. And I think I'm out of time, so I better stop. Thanks, everybody.
Is there gonna be a transition, or I am the transition? Okay, I guess I can begin. Thank you very much, Heidi and Gillian, for providing the building blocks for this talk, actually. And as Cilene announced, I'm going to talk about nominalization. So why study nominalization, apart from the fact that we are now 50 years on from Chomsky's remarks? Well, there are several reasons. First of all, as now...
I'm sorry, Artemis. I'm a little late here trying to deal with two different computers at the same time. Okay. Yes, now we're going to have lecture by Professor Artemis Alexiadou. Thank you. And let's move on.
Okay, so one of the reasons why it's interesting to look at nominalizations is the fact that nouns and verbs. Well, there are several reasons. I'm hearing an echo. Can you also...
Sorry, Artemis. I'm a little little late here trying to deal with two different computers at the same time. Yes, now we're going to have a lecture by Professor Artemis Alexiadou. Thank you. And let's move on.
Okay, so one of the reasons why it's interesting to look at nominalizations is the fact that nouns and verbs. I hope it works now because I'm hearing it twice. So as nouns and the verbs that are derived from are morphologically and semantically related, we need to understand this complex relationship. And we further need to understand how the mixed verbal and nominal properties of nominalizations, of the different types of nominalizations, come about, and how the verbal nouns differ from verbs. By doing so, we probe into the building blocks of meaning. And importantly, studying nominalization helps us test and enrich theories of argument structure, as the question of whether or not nouns like verbs have argument structure is an issue of controversy. So there is some consensus that emerged quite early, actually, in the literature on nominalization, relating to the fact that when we're talking about nominalization, this is not a unified process. So we find a lot of variation in patterns of nominalizations within a language and across languages. For example, in remarks on nominalization, where the empirical domain of discussion was English gerunds and derived nominals, it was clear that they do differ quite a lot from each other. But by now we have numerous studies of typologically diverse languages where we see that there's a lot of variation when it comes to the amount of nominal and verbal properties that characterize the different types of nominalizations. And typically, as Chomsky in the recent overview or revisiting of his remarks article notes, one category of nominalizations is quite a problematic, but applying the same mechanisms to all types of nominalizations is challenging and controversial. So specifically, asking questions about argument structure and nominalizations, there are three questions that I would like to address. The first one is whether argument structure in nominals emerges differently than in the verbal domain. The second one is why arguments are not necessarily present within nominalization. And the third one is why are nominal arguments encoded differently from verbal arguments? So typically there are genitives or prepositional phrases. There's a lot of literature, of course, that has looked at these questions. With respect to question one, where there are two options to take, and both of them have been argued for in the literature. So for example, a possible answer is, no, of course, that's completely identical. So some version of the VP within nominals hypothesis or event structure and nominalization will account for the fact that argument structure emerges exactly the same way in nominals as in the verbal domain. And the second answer is, yes, argument structure in nominal is completely different from arguments structure in the verbal domain. And that is now respectively of whether or not one believes that there is a verbal source in the nominalization. With respect to the second questions, again, we have here various answers. Grimshaw's work emphasized that actually, when we concentrate on a particular type of nominals, the presence of argument structure is obligatory. Other work suggests that arguments are not obligatory with nominals because nouns lack ordered arguments to begin with. And with respect to the encoding of nominal arguments, a lot of work has suggested that maybe nominalizations are passive-like structures, and the fact that we find different encoding is simply related to the fact that actually these nominal arguments are within a noun phrase. So recall what Gillian said in her talk. about the event complexity in general. If one follows the view that nouns lack ordered arguments, this view basically rejects the idea that was put forth in work by Rappaport, Hofeld, and Levine, that there must be at least one argument in the syntax per sub-event in the event structure. In light of Ramchand's talk, it is now important to address the question of whether or not nouns, like verbs, may express events of certain complexity, which in turn means that they are subject to the same principles guiding the emergence of argument structure. And this was actually something that was worked out in great detail by Jane Grimshaw. And Grimshaw, in her seminal work, proposed that nominals are three-way ambiguous. They are nouns that denote complex events, like the examination of the students, and these are like verbs and have argument structure. And importantly, they are like verbs because they denote events which can be broken into aspectual subparts. There are other nouns that denote simple events, such as trip and race, which do not have argument structure. And finally, there are result nouns that can be both derived and underived and also do not have argument structure. So the important contribution there was that we have to distinguish between nouns that have argument structure and those that do not. And the two are distinguished from one another on the basis of a battery of diagnostics, which are shown here in this slide. The ones that you see underlined are the ones I'm going to take a closer look at because they have been the topic of much discussion in more recent literature after Grimshaw. So I'm going to look at the event reading, at the spectral modifiers, at pluralization, and the use of biphrases. So to begin with, remember Grimshaw put forth a tripartition. Several researchers have been arguing that this tripartition is problematic, and it's problematic because it aims to link the presence of argument structure to the presence of event interpretations. But here we have the so-called simple event nominals. These denote events but lack argument structure. A second point that was made was that if you look at the diagnostics and you take a careful look at them from a cross-linguistic perspective, then you see that they do not hold cross-linguistically, but also maybe there are problems within a single language. And here, the diagnostic I would like to discuss is the one of pluralization, where it was noted by several people that it is not the case that arguments supporting nominals do not pluralize, and we have here an example in 2. So what this literature pointed out is that when it comes to this diagnostic, we have to relativize it to take into account the atelicity of the verbal predicate. So what seems to be the correct generalization or diagnostic is that nominalizations of atelic predicates resist pluralization. And another thing that may play a role is the role of plural number, which might not be identical across languages. But there are more issues with Grimshaw's typology and the diagnostics she put forth. So for example, it was pointed out that nominals are more flexible than predicted by this typology. So for example, we have examples as in 3, where we have a synthetic compound, gas treatment, and this compound appears together with an aspectual prepositional phrase. And now synthetic compounds are not generally assumed to be argument supporting nominals. So here we have a case where the criteria do not really match. And in the example in 4, we have another case where we have a biphrase appearing together with a derived nominal destruction, But according to Grimshaw, the biphrase occurs in the presence of the internal argument, and in 4, the internal argument is simply not present. So this Grimshaw's typology and the discussion it caused is actually a good thing. It's progress for the study of nominalization, because for all these issues that I mentioned here, and of course there are other issues that were discussed in the literature, it leads us to sharpen the notion of event complexity. So event complexity has to be understood as Gillian presented in her talk. It also led the research to reconsider how exactly simple event nominals are formed in the syntax and how they're semantically composed. And moreover, it led researchers to reconsider the relationship between axioms are property and number, and between nominal and verbal layers in nominals in general. And moreover, it led us to really think harder about synthetic compounds and whether or not these really lack argument structure, or as actually anticipated in Grimshaw's work and in earlier work in the 90s by Di Sciullo, actually do have argument structure. And more importantly, it leads us to study other languages. And by looking at other languages, we'll learn more about the properties of nominalizations in general and argument structure in nominals in particular, as there is an issue with English prepositional phrases often are independently allowed in environments which have no relationship to a verbal source. And other languages like Greek, Hebrew, or Spanish have special prepositions for these functions. So how does argument structure emerge in nominals? A very natural view to follow on the basis of what we heard from Gillian and Heidi is the so-called verbal or complex event substructure hypothesis. On the basis, according to this hypothesis, only nominalizations that have a complex event structure can have arguments. And the internal complex structure of verbs, as we have seen in Gillian's presentation, is included within nominals. So basically, this means that these nominalizations that have arguments do so because they contain verbal layers that realize this event complexity, as Heidi actually outlined in her presentation. And of course, there are nouns that do not take arguments. There are result nouns or are nouns. But that doesn't mean that these nouns that lack aspectual subparts cannot combine with other nouns. And there are several proposals in the literature as to how to structure and semantically compose relationships of possession. And I think Heidi mentioned that also at the end of her presentation, that we need to have an independent system to create these possession relationships. And what is interesting from the point of view of nominalization is that the genitive in the argument supporting nominals differs from the genitive of possession. And one environment that Grimshaw discussed was the copula. So the construction was the buildings, doesn't sound so good, but the dog is John's is perfectly fine. So there is something about the internal argument of the nominalization and the possessor that distinguishes the two, and the former cannot appear across the copula. So in 7, we see a structure for arguments in nominals where the labels FP1 and FP2 are neutral with respect to labeling, and Heidi in her presentation included material to fill in this label. So it could be init, it could be voice, it doesn't really matter. What is important here is that there are 2 layers that introduce the external and the internal argument, and they are in hierarchical relation. And what is important here is that these layers are phrasal and they do not involve the formation of a complex head. So what is nominalization from the basis of the structure. So we have some units of word formation, and the basic units of word formation are roots, which combine with functional heads, as Heidi mentioned in her talk. And nominalization involves the combination of layers that introduce arguments and maybe higher heads. I will talk about this in a moment, with a nominalization affix that is in the N layer. Or for other types of nominalization, it could be that basically we have the layers introducing the arguments, some functional material, and higher up the D head for closal nominalization. And from this perspective, the hierarchical representation of argument positions correlates with the hierarchical position of the sub-event they're related to. And what is implicit in this type of representation is that the root that we have in the structure does not introduce arguments. So how do we put this together? So here we have some examples from English. It's completely straightforward. So an 8, John's destroying the manuscript, the English gerund. Both external and internal argument are present. In 9, the derived nominal, the destruction of the manuscript, only the internal argument is present. And in 10, Hurricane Dorian leaves a terrible destruction in the Bahamas. None of the arguments is present, and this is not a case of an argument supporting nominal. The type of structure that I have just shown you correlates or can be described also in terms of the so-called functional nominalization thesis. And this thesis basically says that the nominal properties of the nominalization are contributed by nominal functional projections. The nominalization has verbal properties below the nominal functional projection that creates the nominalization, and verbal properties and nominal properties above it. And basically the nominal functional head that selects a verbal projection closes all of the verbal properties of the structure. So the structure is verbal below that point and nominal above, citing here work by Korfeld and Whitman. And now everything we've heard from Gillian and Heidi about the structure, the semantic and syntactic structure of verbal events combines with a lot of work in the 90s, starting in the 90s and going on till today, with the issue of the functional sequence. So we don't only have the part of the structure that we are interested in today, that introducing the argument structure, but we have higher heads that bring different properties to the structure. And the functional nominalization thesis basically says that whatever version of the functional sequence you believe in or you think is the right one, you can take parts of this sequence and create a nominalization. And this relates to what Heidi was mentioning in her talk, that we're looking at sizes of nominalization. So there are nominalizations that involve many of these projections in the functional sequence, and nominalizations that involve fewer of them. And typically, one describes this as the height of nominalization. So it's important to look where the nominalization affix is introduced. And these two ideas, so the functional sequence in combination with the functional nominalization thesis, lead to a very rich typology of nominalizations across languages. And basically, in addition to the argument introducing heads, you have other functional categories that belong to the functional sequence that are part of the nominalization. So the height gives you, as in the case of participles that Heidi discussed, low and high nominalizations. So high nominalizations have several verbal properties. They include high heads in this functional sequence, so aspect, tense, and maybe CP even, where low nominalizations have fewer verbal properties and maybe include only the layers that introduce arguments, and maybe not even both of them. So the more verbal the property is, the more likely it is that both the heads introducing arguments will be present in the nominalization because of the functional sequence. So if tense is included, it follows that also the projections below tense will be included. The less verbal the property is, the less likely it is that both of the heads introducing arguments will be present in the nominalization. And there is by now very rich literature on the diagnostics detecting verbal and nominal properties, so looking at the type of determiners, the type of modifiers, and the type of case patterns that are allowed in the nominalization. So now the presence and encoding of arguments is correlated with the amount of verbal and nominal properties. Typically in so-called high nominalizations, both arguments are present, and external arguments may bear genitive, while internal arguments bear accusative. In low nominalizations, maybe only the internal argument is present, and typically they bear genitive, and here again English is the case in point. So the first case is the English gerund, the second case is the English derived nominal. With respect to the encoding of arguments, if we look at external arguments, which can serve as preposition phrases or genitives, the preposition phrase encoding can be related, and some people have argued that it relates to the fact that, well, at the end of the day, the process of nominalization involves some change in valency, and there are different ways to conceptualize this. So it could be that it's very similar to passivization, or it could be that nominalization in general is subject to an unaccusativity requirement. With respect to the genitive encoding of the external argument, this, I think everybody's in agreement following Abney that it's related to the fact that there is a D layer on top of the nominal structure. With respect to the encoding of the internal argument as a genitive, here assuming that nominalization involves some kind of change in valency, leading to the absence of internal argument, accusative case is not, let's say, an option, and genitive appears as the default nominal case. This brings me now to my last slide, my summary and my conclusion. So the study of different types of nominalizations furthers our understanding of word formation processes and building blocks of meaning. It's important test ground for theories of word formation and argument structure. And my general conclusion goes in the line of actually both Gillian's and Heidi's conclusions. So if arguments are introduced hierarchically in association with event complexity in the verbal domain, nouns derived from verbs are built on the basis of the same building blocks. And in addition, grammar has further mechanisms in place to introduce nominal satellites in the absence of event complexity. Thank you very much.
I think there's going to be some delay with Cilene coming online with us, so we just wait. I'm sure she will be here eventually.
Sorry, I'm back.
There you are.
We are having here a problem with a delay in transmission. But so let's see how it's going. Can you hear me well? Yes? Okay. So we have some of the participants asked if you can share, if you can post the slides on your webpage.
Yes.
For sure.
Of course, yes. Derived from verbs are built on the basis of the same building blocks. And in addition, grammar has further mechanisms in place to introduce nominal satellites in the absence of difficult complexity. Thank you very much.
Yes, we're
Professor
having
again. I don't know what happened. I had this in the beginning, so I don't know what happened.
I'm so sorry. Technology is not perfect yet. Sorry. So some of the participants, thank you all. First of all, thank you all for your beautiful talks. It was really great to.
I think there's going to be some delay with Cilene coming. Interested in anything?
Sorry, I'm back. There you are. We are having here a problem with a delay in transmission. But so let's see how it's going. Okay, so let me see what I can do here to help to make this work. We do have a problem here.
It's like something from a weird time travel science fiction movie.
Exactly, that's what I was thinking. And I had it in the beginning of the talk, and I said, "Oh my God, it's going to be this weird thing that everybody's going to hear my talk twice."
Yeah, it's really bad. It's really it was really messing up with everything. So let me start again. Thank you all for your beautiful talk. It was amazing. I learned a lot from you all. Thanks a lot, and I'm sure that all the people that are there really appreciated your contributions. Thank you. So some of the participants asked if you can post your slides on your webpage. Would that be fine?
Yes.
Yes, please. Thank you. So we do have some questions here. We have a participant. I think he's talking about Heidi's talk, and he said that he did not quite understand exactly why, for example, in Turkish, the embedded theme cannot be bound by the causative. Can you talk about it, please, Heidi?
Yes, I will share my handout again and sit back up there. It relies on an assumption that I maybe didn't have time to dwell on. Oops, I went too far. Dwell on enough, that the voice phrase is a binding domain. So here is the embedded verb in a Japanese causative, and it comes with its voice head and its external argument. Now, if we assume that that voice head is a binding domain, then the pronoun has to be free within that first voice P. And even if it's bound by the subject of the matrix, the causative voice P, that binding domain requirement is met in Japanese. So we've got this hypothesis that the voice P is the binding domain. Now let's see what happens in Turkish. If we assume that the causative does not embed a voice P, but instead embeds a little VP, now the binding domain of the pronoun is going to extend all the way up to this causative voice P, the external argument that's associated with the causative head. So the pronoun, which belongs to the embedded verb, here is the theme of the embedded verb, it has to be free. It cannot be co-referent with any sequamending argument within this whole domain. That includes now the causative argument. So that's the idea. It kind of crucially relies on a connection between the voice head and the binding domain of a verb, which might be true or it might not, but it fits with what we see. We could look for reasons that we might think it was true, like, for example, there's a lot of arguments about the status of unbound variables at phase edges. For example, voice P. If voice P is a phase edge, then we might expect that it would define a binding domain. I hope that was clear, and I will make my materials available in case you want to look at that a little more.
Thank you. Now we have a question from, I believe it's from Luana Amaral, and she said, can you talk about verb classes generalization in these structural properties? And she might be asking this to...
That's Gillian's job.
Yes.
Is that me?
I guess.
Okay.
Yes.
We decided it's you.
So the question is, talk about verb. Can I hear the question again?
Yes. The question is, can you talk about verbal classes generalizations in these structural perspectives?
Well, I think that the generalization, as I was talking about, are exactly trying to carve out the different natural classes of verbal predicates based on their event structure properties, which seem to correlate with their syntactic behavior. So all of these things so the event structure decomposition I laid out, which is sort of based on semantic diagnostics, they all turn out to have implications for structural hierarchy. And it seems to me that if you look across different languages and see the natural classes of verbs they have. Now, English is very impoverished. You just see, a verb is a verb is a verb is a verb. But there are many languages where you will see, okay, there's a verb with one kind of suffix or a verb with another kind of, little thing attached to the root. And you can see that many languages divide up their verbs into natural classes and which then have structural and morphosyntactic consequences. So the hypothesis here is that I don't think that the human cognitive system is massively different from culture to culture, and that somehow these primitive properties of causation and result are going to be true across, and state versus event. So I will look for exactly those semantic things underpinning different natural classes of verb. And why would we say that something is a natural class unless it had different linguistic behaviors? And that's the key, right? We're not just inventing semantic distinctions. We're trying to see what. So part of the justification of this particular semantic typology is that it does actually carve out the space of verb types in a way that matches language's morphology and the things that syntax tends to care about. I don't know if I answered the question, because I don't think I totally understood the question.
Thank you, Gillian. I think you did a wonderful job. We do have a question now from. The question is now for Artemis, and the question is, how unaccusativity work with nominalizations?
Well, there again, yes, there are again two ways to understand the question, and I'm wondering which one is meant here. So is a question about the nominalization of unaccusative verbs and whether they have complex event structure, or why one would think nominalizations are unaccusatives. I'll answer both in case one of them is correct. Fine. So basically, with respect to the first interpretation of the question, if unaccusative verbs can feed nominalizations, yes, they can. And why can they? Because on the basis of the view that I was outlining here, they also have sub-events. And if they have sub-events, they can be part of this general architecture that Gillian and Heidi were presenting, and thus feed nominalization where internal arguments are included. On the second interpretation of the question, I tried to outline the two options that I see by looking at very different languages and by reading work by other colleagues. It seems to be the case that nominalization does, not every type, but some types of nominalization do something very similar to passivization by somehow either getting rid of the external argument and forcing it to be realized as a prepositional phrase, or by excluding it altogether. I personally think that this is a property a feature of the nominalizations that people describe as low nominalizations. And I think it follows from, if you believe in the functional sequence and believe that arguments are introduced the way they're introduced, the lower the nominalization, then, if it attaches to, I don't know, the little VP or something, or even at that level, then it will exclude the external argument. And of course will not contain any of the higher information involved. So I hope I answered both interpretations of the question.
Thank you. Now we have a general question from Janaína Carvalho. And her question is, considering that some lexicalist approaches use templates to decompose verbal meaning, would you say that there is a convergence in argument structure studies nowadays in identifying that several properties of argument structure alternations come from building blocks of verbs, nouns, and not, for instance, theta rows?
I think we all want to say something to that one, but I want to jump in and say, first of all, I think that's what I'm talking about when I talk about consensus. Absolutely, absolutely true. I think that when you look in the lexicalist framework and you see these templates of decomposed verbal meaning, and they're seeing the argument slotting in there, they're doing exactly the same thing that the so-called constructivists are doing with their little trees, right? We mustn't get misled or I mean, of course, it's nice to have a particular framework you're working in and you do a concrete implementation, but we mustn't be bamboozled by the implementation and miss the fact that everybody within these different implementations, they really are converging on many of the same substantive universals in terms of what are these semantic building blocks and how do arguments kind of get inserted around event descriptions. So that was sort of, I mean, I didn't have time to like lay it out and show, look, this framework is saying the same thing. But I absolutely believe that at least at the level that I was speaking, there's massive convergence.
So, I mean, 100%. And I think that that's one of the beauties of the approach in general, is that we all get to exploit these very important results that have enhanced our understanding. The kind of syntacticization of those hierarchical structures in the kind of work that I was showing, or that Artemis was showing, lets us leverage aspects of that semantic decomposition to account for morphosyntactic patterns. And in a lexicalist framework, that pans out a little bit differently. What in fact tends to start happening is that more and more and more of what we would think of as syntactic structure starts getting shoehorned into the sort of lexical side of things. And that in itself is a kind of convergence, right? We start to recognize that all of these phenomena have to be coped with inside the same, module of the grammar. Hopefully in the sort of minimalist world, we've just got this one module, the syntax, to do it. But if you're in a lexical, generative lexicon kind of view of the world, you can do more and more and more of it in that lexical component. And things that you think of as syntax, like binding or coordination or whatever else, start getting shoehorned into the lexicon. And so then we're all doing the same work in the end, coming to the same conclusions.
Yeah, I have a question. Sorry.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I fully agree with what Gillian and what Heidi said, and I couldn't have put it better myself. So I'm happy.
We agree. Mm.
Okay, I have a question for
all
you.
For one and one for all.
Musketeers, that's us.
I have a question for you with respect to this. Why is it that we have a limited number of argument structure configurations? How do you see this? Is this some kind of, cognitive constraint? Or it's a linguistic constraint?
I think it starts with a cognitive constraint. I think the way humans delimit events, what they consider, what's a thing, what's a single event. There's been there's sort of interesting psychological work done on perceiving the world, event perception. When, you know, you show somebody pictures and you say, okay, how many events did you see, right? And this is sort of across different languages and cultures and different types of tasks where you use language or not. People tend to, just the way they perceive action and causation, and it turns out that people come up with the same numbers of events, or at least the same sorts of sizes of package that they would be willing to give a label to, right? So it's part of our cognition, which of course is going to be determined by the kinds of things we as humans have to pay attention to in our lives, the size or the granularity of events that have a causal impact on the size of our bodies and the things we need to do. So I think that that's going to have to be, we have that anyway, and that's going to have to be some kind of cognitive underpinning to the system we have. And there's going to be loads of flexibility, but there's going to be a bedrock of commonality there, just because of the way we as humans end up delineating the world and packaging up events for perception and memory and labeling.
I'll just add to that I mean, I think Gillian's right in the end. The way that I came to this sort of syntactic decomposition project was via Helen Kaiser's proposal, which was exactly the opposite. It was saying we've got these kind of core linguistic building blocks, the X-bar template, and the amount of arguments that we can have are constrained by those building blocks, by the nature of those building blocks. Now our building blocks are quite different. And we have this very unconstrained structure building mechanism merge that doesn't actually in and of itself limit the compositional possibilities of the system. Furthermore, with the connection of sub-eventual structure to these pieces, I think we are constrained more by the cognitive representation of sub-eventual structure than we are by merge, which is not super constrained.
Yeah, doesn't do very much anymore, merge. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I agree. I mean, what can I do? I agree.
I'm gonna have to let you talk.
This is not a fight.
Yeah. This was never billed as a fight, right? We're presenting a unified front, but we have different areas of expertise. I think that's important. This kind of whole discussion here we've been having, I think it's really one of the success stories of generative grammar. There's so much work has been done in this area, and we are so much smarter about it than we used to be. And we're not fighting each other, at least as far as I can tell.
So it's sort of funny because I was a little disappointed that we weren't going to get to have a fight, because there's nothing that I love more than fighting with Artemis and Gillian about minor little differences that we might like. Those are really fun fights.
Those are fun. I enjoy doing that too.
But they're probably mostly fun because we know that fundamentally we actually are on the same page about all of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because remember, we decided to exclude the question of whether roots have arguments as one of the.
Right about that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we could. Yeah.
Face to face. Yeah.
Okay. You had a little chat about what you should include and what you should exclude. Great. I have a question now that I really want to talk about, which is about affectedness. So it's not something that you guys talked about, but I really like this notion because it's not something that you can easily map into a theta role, right? But it's somehow we perceive it. For example, Heidi was talking about possessive datives. And there is this idea that possessive datives related to her data in 5 and 6, 5 from English and 6 from Spanish. And possessive datives, it seems that they are possible only when the internal argument is affected. So how do you see the notion of affected as part of the argument structure. For example, I believe that John Beavers, in his 2011 paper, he assumes it to be a theta rho. How do you see it now?
Can I go? Or I mean, look. I think that it's a label. It's a term for a thing. I think what I was talking about is precisely when you talk about the undergoer, it's the holder of a changing property. That I'm just formalizing certain different kinds of affectedness. So you can be the holder of a changing property. You're an undergoer. It's a kind of affectedness. There's another kind of affectedness where you hold a result state in addition. That's a maybe on Beavers's hierarchy, that's like even more affected because you come to a definitive resultant state. But then there are the ones that are affected, but are also exerting some initiational force. And then they're sort of affected, but they could be caused by another people. Yeah, so you can make a continuum out of it. But the notion of affectedness was very important as an early notion when Carol Tenney came out with her stuff early on in 1984. She used the term affectedness, but she was pointing to that same thing that I say has now really been acknowledged by everybody and built into all of these more eventy decomposition theories. So I would say, sure, it's an important notion, but it's a kind of, for me, it's a historical artifact as a label.
So you don't believe it is related to it does not involve projection of a sub-event.
No.
It's just the way we perceive these relations among sub-events. Is that
it's an old label, and it relates to the event structure I presented. That's the correct one, and then you have to I think it's a disagreement about what you label as the primitive thing, right? That's the difference there between what the sort of John Beavers might be saying about, in his framework. We all have slightly different axiomatizations of this same general terrain. I don't know if it helps, but.
I mean, with respect to the applicatives per se, that's exactly the point of Cuervo's analysis that I was taking in vain, is that she really relies on showing the difference between the possessive datives and the affected datives as being really two different semantic classes that are connected to the event structure entailments of the verbs, whether there's a result state, whether there's an activity, and so on. But the kind of formalism that we're looking at with the little v and the root p enables us to sort of talk about the structural correlates of having a result state or not, or having an activity or not. And so the hope is, although I didn't work this out or propose a friendly amendment to Cuervo's analysis in the end, the hope is that those tools would let us encode that aspect of effectiveness that affect the projection of those datives in a structural way and not just in a semantic way. That said, the work I wanted to also say, this is on my handout, but I didn't get to say it at the end. This program has now led to work that pushes back. So Beavers and Kuhn-Skarboden is one great example. I have a group of students here at the University of Arizona, Jianrong Yu and Ryan Smith, and their collaborator. Sorry, Joseph, I can't remember how to say your last name exactly now. But anyway, who are looking at whether a lot of these sort of concepts that we're saying should be part of the decomposed event structure actually are built into the roots. And they're finding compelling arguments that we need to actually go back a bit and put some of these entailments into the roots and not let them just come in from the structure. And it's the picture.
I think they're in the roots too,
I know you think they're in the roots. But in a complicated way. That's right. No, but in the words, in a complicated way, not in a feature-y. Anyway, we will no doubt have more to say.
So I just want to add to that, because affectness has played a role also in the discussion of nominalization, because it was in work by Mon Anderson in the 70s, I believe, the question was which genitives can you prepose, and apparently the generalization was that you can only have prenominal genitives that are affected. But once you look at the data, actually it comes, the generalization breaks down to what Gillian was saying, that it has to do with the event complexity. So if you have a state, the facts knowledge doesn't sound very good, but the building's construction is fine. And the difference between the two has to do with the type of event they're describing and how complex the event is. So ultimately, I think I agree with Gillian that it's a label. It describes an empirical domain, but maybe the generalizations that bring about that do in fact relate with to event decomposition and the presence of sub-event structures.
Great. I have a final question here, which is actually related to a question of mine, and I'm going to put John P's question together with mine. So John asked, how do you guarantee that little v doesn't appear in, say, unaccusatives, such as Peter arrived, Mary? Is this through simple selection of particular type of big VP? So that's his question. My question is, so basically, we are playing with valency by removing functional categories. So many people assume that when you have an accusative alternation, John broke the vase and the vase broke, we're removing layers within the argument structure. So we remove, for example, little VP and voice V. But it might be, it's hard to constrain this operation of removing functional categories. That's one thing. The other one is Kuhn's Harmonics work, for example, has shown that he gives evidence that in Romance, when you have something like the vase broke, el vaso se rompió in Spanish, for example, the se morpheme does not really sign that you removed the causative event or sub-event, but actually it's more like a reflexivization of the predicate, because you can have in these cases modifiers related to the agent. And the same you'll see, for example, in middle constructions in Romance, that you can have, like, for example, biphrases and so on. So how do you see this? How do you see this idea, right, that actually we are removing functional categories in cases of alternations?
You should let Artemis go first on this one.
Yeah, so I think the way, at least I see it, or I see it in joint work with Elena Nagnosopoulos and Florian Schäfer, is more along the lines that you don't actually remove or add, but you have a common core, and then you build, different types of structures, and you can pick the bigger structure that will lead to the causative event, and then you can build the smaller type of structure that will be the smaller the anti-causative event. And it's actually very interesting. I mean, the first example you mentioned with Peter arrived, Mary. I mean, here, when you look at other languages, you see that they can actually do things like that. So then you start wondering, why is it that in English, this type of verbs do not combine the way that break does? And then you can say, okay, arrive is a verb of change of location, and maybe the verbs of change of location do not have the same structure as verbs of change of state. Okay, not exactly the same components because there's something else involved. And this type of structure does not in English combine with the initiator or the agent, however you want to call that external argument. Now, with respect to the, I think we could fight about this, whether the reflexive morphology you see in Spanish or in other languages, or the non-active morphology that you see in Greek is reflexive. We spent quite some time arguing that is actually not reflexive. And here you really need to look at the different morphologies that are present in the different languages. So Spanish and German, for example, have reflexive pronouns, but other languages have non-active morphology. But when you look at the properties of these constructions, they do not seem to behave like reflexives on other counts. And I think Florian Schäfer, together with Vivanco, I think it's her name, had a reply actually to Kunska-Borden's analysis of reflexives. So this is something actually that one could fight about. So there are the views in favor and the views against.
Any other comments on this?
Can I just say, like, I do agree with Artemis that the most important thing is we have to start thinking not in terms of like demoting arguments or whatever. We have to be thinking more in this structure building approach. So I think what we know nowadays has really changed the way we frame the problems to ourselves. And I think sometimes you can get locked into old ways of thinking by thinking reflexive and thinking, in 80s terminology, but it's really refreshing to rethink that whole package and think of it more in terms of the structure building. And then, of course, Artemis is also right that she and I probably disagree about that particular reflexive morphology, but that would take way too long to fight about. That's not.
And I would a whole session.
And lots more people. I would just like to say that the notion of removing structure, failing to project structure as a way of not having an argument that you might otherwise expect, versus having the structure but not having the argument, is another kind of point of flexibility or difference in the analysis. So, if you have, to look at Rembrandt's work on infinitives, you can have an infinitive that has a tense phrase there with a particular infinitive variety of tense, or you can just leave the tense phrase out entirely and just have the verb phrase there. In the same way, you could imagine a subjectless projection of voice, which has say a non-active voice and lacks an external argument, not because it's absent, but because of the particular featural makeup of voice. Or you could imagine a subjectless projection that was the way it was because the voice head is absent. So all of those tools are available to us to look at projection or failure of projection of particular arguments.
That's right, yeah. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. Like it's there, but it's inactive. And it converses well, for example, with this idea of phases and the work done by Legats and so on and so forth. Her points. All right, let me see if you have another question here. No, I think that's it. I think we
must be out of time by now, surely.
We are 13 minutes late. Yeah. All right, so thank you very, very much. It was great. It's great contribution. Thanks again. And again, you guys serve as roles, as models for us women. You are great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies.
Cilene, thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you guys soon.
Good night in Berlin.
Good night, Arizona. Good morning from Arizona still.
Ciao, ciao. This is afternoon for me. Ciao, ciao.
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 Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.